In this video, I'll be taking a look at 6 different countries when they were at their greatest territorial extent, as well as all territory they ever held, and a somewhat realistic greater version of these countries that could have been. If you haven't watched my first 4 videos in this series, you can find the playlist for the series on my channel. In the first video, I also provide an explanation of irredentism and the topic as a whole. But with that said, let's get to it. Norway. Norway is a nation that has lost quite a bit in its history. When it was in a union with Denmark, it fought many wars with Sweden, which resulted in it along with Denmark losing quite a bit to Sweden. Norway, at its greatest extent, is arguably in the Middle Ages, a few centuries after it had converted to Christianity. Here Norway still had its island settlements in the west, and its border with Sweden was a lot further east. If you include all lands that have been a part of Norway, or at the very least lightly settled and claimed by Norway, you get this. In the far north, Norway contested the mostly Sami-inhabited Arctic lands with Sweden and the Novgorod Republic, so although it didn't directly control all that land, it did claim it. During the Viking era, it also controlled a lot of territory in Scotland, as well as the Isle of Man and Dublin. A more realistic Greater Norway could look something like this. For this Greater Norway to exist, when it was in a union with Denmark-Norway would have had to negotiate a treaty with Scotland which allowed them to keep the Shetland Islands. They would also have had to push their claim more in the far north, allowing Norway to get a larger share of the contested territory. If in addition to all this, Denmark-Norway would also have won more of their wars with Sweden, the consequence of this would be Norway keeping Jämtland and Bohuslän. Lastly, when Norway finally gains its independence from Denmark, they could have negotiated for Norway to keep Iceland and the Faroes. Finland. Finland is a fairly new nation, which doesn't have much of an expansionist history. Despite that, Finland was a bit larger before the Winter War and World War II, where they lost some territory to the Soviet Union. So this right here, Finland before the Winter War, is Finland at its height. But as for a somewhat realistic Greater Finland, I actually think it would be even larger and look something like this. A Finland including what is today the Murmansk Oblast and Karelia. Several things could have resulted in Finland controlling these territories. If the Kalmar Union and later Sweden were more invested in the land, which was disputed by them and the Novgorod Republic, it could have ended up as a part of Finland. The lands were until well into the Middle Ages actually mostly home to the Sami and Karelians, people closely related to the Finns. Poland. Poland is a nation which has had quite different borders throughout history. Poland at its height would be the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, an entity which even went as far as to occupy Moscow for a short while, and controlled much of Eastern Europe. If you include all lands that have ever been under Polish control, you get this monster of an empire, since Poland has had several eras of great expansion, both in the east and west. A more realistic Greater Poland, though, could be this. Not the prettiest borders, but ones which would include regions in old Eastern Poland that had a large Polish population. Poland could have kept these territories in a world where the Soviets simply decided to be a bit more lenient with their land grab in Poland. It is conceivable that the USSR could have let Poland keep slightly more territory in the east, mainly in the regions with a large Polish population. The Kaliningrad Oblast could potentially also have been given to Poland had they shown an interest in the land after the fall of the USSR. Bulgaria. Bulgaria, much like Poland, is a nation which has had quite different borders throughout its history. Bulgaria at its greatest extent would be the First Bulgarian Empire in the 9th century. If you include all lands that have been under Bulgarian rule at some point, you get this. But a more realistic Greater Bulgaria would not be quite so ambitious, and could look something like this. It would exist in a scenario where the Serbians upheld their agreement with the Bulgarians during the First Balkan War. Here it was promised by Serbia that they would allow Bulgaria to receive the lion's share of Macedonia. This could have resulted in better relations between the two nations and the less discontent in expansionist Bulgaria, which would in turn lead to no Second Balkan War and Bulgaria keeping the lands it occupied before the Second Balkan War. Bulgaria would likely also stay out of the First World War in this world. Australia. Australia is not talked about much in the alternate history community, and that is of course not without reason. Australia as an independent nation is fairly new, and it never controlled much beyond its home continent. But Australia at its height did still control what is today Papua New Guinea. A realistic Greater Australia, as I see it, would actually be even larger than this though. Before Australia was established as a Commonwealth, it consisted of 8 colonies, among them New Zealand and Fiji. Essentially, when the drafting of the union between these colonies was written, New Zealand and Fiji opted out even though it was assumed they would join. So, quite simply, if they had chosen to participate in the drafting, they could have become a part of Australia. For this episode, Smaller Country, I am widening the definition a bit, since there are only so many micronations in the world. So, let's take a look at Armenia. First of all, this is not me taking some stance on the current dispute and conflict in the region, and I will include Azerbaijan in a future video in this series. It's simply me showing how Armenia could have been larger if history went differently. I mean, this is fiction, don't freak out. Armenia is a country that is a shadow of its former self. Today it is a fairly small post-Soviet state in the Caucasus region, with an ongoing territorial dispute with Azerbaijan. Armenia at its greatest extent, which also happens to include all territory that has ever been under Armenian control, is this. It existed in this form for around a decade till roughly the year 70 BCE, after which it was still substantially larger than today for centuries. But without changing history massively, Armenia could not have retained such an empire, so a more realistic Greater Armenia that would require only minor changes in the timeline is something like this. For Armenia to have these borders today, 2 main things would have to change. First, the Soviet Union would have sided more with Armenia when they retook the lands after defeating the White Army, and thus given Armenia more favorable borders, which include the current disputed area with Azerbaijan, as well as the Azerbaijani exclave. The other main thing that would have to change is the Russian Empire, later USSR, keeping its pre-World War I border with Turkey. This could have happened if they either performed slightly better in the war, held out for longer, or negotiated their way out of losing that land. If the USSR still had this land, they would likely have given the land to Armenia and Georgia, who would have kept the territory till this day. But that's all for now. Hope this shorter video taking a look at a few irredentist scenarios and countries at their historical maximum was interesting. Don't forget to leave a like, subscribe, and hit the bell button if you enjoyed the video and want to see more content like this in the future. Also, stay tuned for the continuation of my Scandinavia series and a lot more interesting projects coming soon. See you next time.